Hello and welcome to this talk. My name is Joanna SIKORA and I am an Associate Professor of Sociology at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for an opportunity to present in this forum, and thank you all for joining me in this session. Let me see if I can share my screen now. Hopefully this works. At the beginning, I think I need to clarify that I consider teleworkability, and what I ask about is whether it matters if boys and girls prefer careers that differ with respect to how much work can be done from home. Before I begin, I have to acknowledge one important limitation of my analysis. Gender is diverse and non-binary, but the data I use in my analysis contrasts only boys with girls without any information about non-binary or intersex youth. The other thing that would be probably good to explain is that I understand teleworkability as the ability to work from home using electronic devices such as networked computers, tablets, or mobile phones. And by careers, I understand jobs, but those that are performed for a significant period in a person's life and have opportunities for progress. Of course, telework as an idea is not new. It has been around for at least 30 years. However, the pandemic forced a lot of people in teleworkable jobs, if not all of them, to rely full-time on telework, and this has been unprecedented. And it raises important questions about the nature of telework going into the future and its potential impact to transform the working lives of young people. For instance, is telework just another form of a digital divide? Or questions about the traditional gender segregation and whether gender segregation in employment affects access to telework? Or are jobs traditionally preferred by women more teleworkable than those preferred by men? So just to look at these issues, I will analyze data from the longitudinal survey of Australian youth. And this is data that contains information about adolescent expectations of occupational careers, but also the actual jobs that are done by young people between age 16 and 26. Telework is a concept a bit more narrow than remote work and definitely more narrow than working from home. The broadest of these is working from home, as this contains or relates to any work, whether it be performed by employees or the self-employed, and whether or not it involves information and communication technology. But even though I use the label of telework in my presentation, what I analyze here is any form of work from home. And for this, I use the framework proposed by Jonathan Dingel and Brent Neiman in their 2020 paper titled "How Many Jobs Can Be Done at Home?" Dingel and Neiman used two surveys from the Occupational Information Network in the United States and over a dozen criteria, or even more than that, and they identified the share of workers in each occupation who could work from home. And these shares became scores of teleworkability, and those US occupations and the data for them was then compared to occupations in other countries. So this international extension enables me to use the Dingel and Neiman scores as an analytical tool in my work. Dingel and Neiman's conceptualization is not the only conceptualization of telework. Europe has its own framework discussed in the 2020 working paper produced by the European Commission's Joint Research Center and led by Matteo Sostero. This analysis found that in Europe, like in the United States, and we'll see in a minute also in Australia, about 40% of workers have teleworkable jobs. And people who are most likely to work in these jobs are those more educated, more highly paid, those in positions of authority, and those who live in densely populated urban centers. And all of this suggests that telework could be seen as the privilege of the elite workers. But not all teleworkers are the highly skilled and paid professionals. There are pockets of telework that are performed by people in precarious positions with little work security. So telework is diverse. And as the pandemic showed, it can be something that we have to rely on rapidly. So this makes it important to understand what telework means and how it can be turned to be advantageous for young people. And it also is important for me to see how early career preferences could lead to telework. In Australia, like in the United States or in Europe, about 40% of jobs in the economy are teleworkable. And by industry, we see most teleworkers in education and science and technology, which are two areas that are known to be very heavily segregated by gender. But gender was not the focus of the analysis undertaken by Dingel and Neiman, and it was also not looked at by the analysis undertaken for Australia by James Stratton, whose results I'm showing you in this slide. In Australia, as in the United States, we have similar industries that are dominated or that show higher shares of telework, and of course, occupational status and educational attainment are also positively correlated with telework, which means that people with postgraduate qualifications are more likely to have teleworkable jobs. Gender may be an important dimension of telework because employment is strongly segregated by gender. So as we know, men and women tend to work in different occupations, but also teenage occupational expectations are strongly segregated by gender. And this segregation is something that persists over time from cohort to cohort, as illustrated by some Australian data from some of my papers that I'm showing you in this slide. On the left, we see the proportions of boys on yellow bars and girls on gray bars who planned to become a teacher. Bars show different cohorts of 16-year-olds in the last 20 years, and roughly 3 times as many girls as boys plan to become a teacher, and doesn't seem to change over time. And when we look at science occupations in the upper panel of the right-hand graph, we see work in computing, engineering, and math-related occupations, and we see that roughly 4 times as many boys as girls are interested in these occupations. And this doesn't change greatly from cohort to cohort either. By contrast, girls are more interested in life sciences and health-related occupations. These patterns of segregation, here shown for Australia, are not just limited to one country. They have been found to be pretty much the same in over 80 countries that have so far participated in the PISA surveys. So they are widely entrenched. And then the question that arises in my mind is, how much is telework related to this segregation? First, let us look at what jobs can be done at home. Here I've got a kind of brief or a short version of the list of occupations and the scores of teleworkability. At the top of the list, the most teleworkable jobs are the ones in computing, engineering, and legal jobs, education, so including teachers, as well as highly skilled managers. Amongst the least teleworkable jobs, as you can imagine, will be food preparation assistants, construction trades workers, construction and mining laborers, and people who work on farms or in gardens. So there's some very good discussions of definitions and the criteria that make jobs teleworkable in the literature that I have shown. But I will just move on here and I will tell you more about my data. The data that I'm using comes from the 2009 cohort of the longitudinal study of Australian youth. And this started with the 2009 program for international student assessment. And sample of these students, by definition, involves those who are between 15 and 16 years old at the time. And I'm using 4 waves of the survey because questions about occupational expectations were asked in 2009, 2013, 16, and 19. And I'm also using information about jobs from these surveys. So what I have done to get a really detailed indicator of teleworkability is I use the open-ended question, what kind of job do you expect to have when you are about 30 years old? And these verbatim answers were then coded by the data owners to the Australian and New Zealand standard classification of occupations at the 4-digit level. And then I coded them to the international standard classification of occupations so that I can link them to the Dingel and Neiman teleworking shares. And I just wanted to acknowledge James Stratton's work because it helped me, and particularly access to his code, in obtaining this very good translation or crosswalk between the Australian data and the teleworkability scores derived by Dingel and Neiman. These indicators, the original teleworking indicators, range from 0 to 1, but they can have values in between because there are occupations where, you know, maybe 70% of workers could do work from home or 20% of workers. But for the purpose of this analysis, I dichotomize these scores because it just makes it easier for me to discuss them. And so all occupations that had less than 50% of teleworking or teleworkers were coded to 0. And all of the occupations that had more than 50% of teleworkers were coded to 1. But I wanted to emphasize that my conclusions are exactly the same, whether or not I use the dichotomous version of my variable or a continuous version. So what do we find out about gender differences in expectations of teleworkable jobs? At age 16, we have about 49% of girls who plan a career which is teleworkable, even if they don't realize it or they don't think about it. In contrast, only 42% of boys plan to work in a teleworkable job. These percentages are shown here as proportions, so I must multiply them by 100 to get the percentage figures. As we move on, at 20 years of age, the proportions of teleworkable jobs that girls are interested in go up, and so they do for boys. And moving to ages 22 and then to 25 to 26, what we see is that young men catch up with young women. So by age 26, 59% of women are interested in doing a teleworkable job at age 30, and almost as many, 58% of men. But the problem with these comparisons, as I'm showing them to you now, is that they are based on different numbers of respondents. So you probably noticed that we had about 9,000 teenagers, and then by the time we get to mid-20s, we have just 2,000 respondents. So a better way of analyzing these data is to pull the information from everybody, regardless of when they participated or when they left the survey. And I'm doing this in a 2-level logistic regression model, which I'm about to show you, where annual reports about occupational expectations and jobs are grouped within people who are treated as the 2nd level of analysis. And here I am controlling for time to see whether over time young people are more likely to orient themselves to telework. And I'm also introducing indicators of geography, ethnicity, social class, as well as academic achievement to see whether this changes anything in the size of the gap between boys and girls. Over time, the proportion of youth who nominate a teleworkable job grow. So we can see that from the odds ratio, where we have odds ratios greater than 1, this designates or signifies a positive relationship, and odds ratios less than 1 signify negative relationships. But odds ratios are not intuitively easy to interpret. So I have calculated some probabilities that I will tell you about, although you can't see them in this slide. So there's odds ratio of 1.29 for females, means that with all predictors keep at mean values, say in 2019, 60% of young women expected to work in a tele-workable job, and there were only 56% of such men. So the gender gap was 4%. And other coefficients, going back to indicators of geography, indicated all else being equal, 52% of students from metropolitan schools expected to work in a tele-workable job, but only 47% of students in provincial schools and 43% of students in remote schools. So geography is an important factor here, and students outside of city centers are less likely to pick tele-workable careers. Students who do well at school, as indicated by their PISA reading score, are more likely to opt for tele-workable careers. And students who come from more advantageous social class backgrounds also like telework better. 55% of students from the most advantageous social class background picked a teleworkable career, but only 44% of youth from more disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. And students who are migrants from families where both the student and parents were foreign born are also more likely to opt for telework. 55% of such students would want to work in a teleworkable career, in contrast to only 50% of students born in Australia to Australian parents. So all of these differences suggest that telework could be a new form of digital divide, but of course, all of those expectations matter only when young people actually get to realize these expectations. So let's have a look at the work that young people do. And here, this is just the work done between the ages of 16 and 26. So a lot can happen later, but we know that the jobs which kind of start young people in the labor market have a tendency to set them up for what happens next. So I've got two models here in my last analytical table. Model 1 includes the same predictors as we saw before: geography, ethnicity, academic achievement, and class. But in model 2, I have, in addition to the predictors shown before, also a check as to whether having a plan helps young women more than men, or maybe vice versa. And what we can see, actually we can't see that, but you have to take my word for it because of those calculated probabilities, which I'm not showing in the table, but I will tell you about, is that between the ages of 16 and 26 in Australia, about 28% of women worked in a teleworkable job, but this proportion was only 24% amongst men, so you have this 4% gap. The other thing that is interesting here is that it seems that Aboriginal youth are more likely to work in teleworkable jobs. So I'll have to look at that because this is surprising. And having a plan for telework really helps. 34% of youth who wanted a teleworkable job worked in one, whereas on this proportion was only 16% for youth who didn't have a plan. So twice as many youth who wanted a teleworkable job ended up working in one while being quite young. So having plans is important, but it is equally important for men and women. There are no differences in their likelihood to realize these plans. So what are the implications of this analysis? In some ways, this analysis does not answer very many questions, but I think it poses interesting questions which might be addressed by future research. So firstly, in Australia, and likely also elsewhere, young women opt more often for teleworkable jobs than men. And this difference, while being small, is non-negligible. So what this suggests is that where young women were found to fare less well economically than men in the pandemic, it was definitely not because they prefer non-teleworkable jobs. Because circumstances might force workers to rely on telework quite unexpectedly and to a great extent. And telework might be important For a number of other reasons than pandemic, for environmental reasons, for geographic mobility or family formation reasons, I would argue that teleworkability ought to be better understood. At the aggregate level, patterns of telework are interesting, but students and career counselors and schools would benefit from knowing more about teleworkability at the level of particular occupations, taking into account the context and nature of telework. For instance, the dependence on social interactions, part-time versus full-time telework, authority, seniority, and so on. So teleworkability could be useful not only in times of a pandemic, but also to reduce stress, burnout, to provide more work-life balance, and maybe even to reduce congestion in big metropolis. But the use made of teleworkability will depend not only on employers and preferences of young people, but also a host of other factors, including affordable housing for young people. And therefore, the only thing that I could advocate on the basis of this analysis is to understand better telework and teleworkability, because it can be something very positive, but also negative. It has a potential to be a blessing, but also a curse. So thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have and any suggestions for future research.